Living on a tight budget in the 1970s didn't stop grandmas from whipping up delicious meals. Forget those fancy restaurants. These superwomen turned basic ingredients into mouth-watering, budget-friendly masterpieces that you'll be craving for days. Here is 1 hour of forgotten recipes your grandma always had on the table. Let's start our list off with some potato pancakes, an incredibly famous go-to recipe for grandmas across the nation today. Do you know how and why they ended up nailing the recipe for a fine potato pancake so perfectly, though? Potatoes were one of the most easily available vegetables both when buying with cash or bartering, plus lots of people started growing their own produce. Potatoes were a crop they went for regularly, because the flour and butter needed for a real pancake was not an option for many people. So, potato pancakes became the common breakfast of the century for a good decade or two, and it honestly held its ground pretty well. Made out of grated potatoes and simple seasonings, this felt just as good as a legitimate pancake. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. So, cornmeal mush was the humble, comforting porridge made from, surprise, cornmeal. It became all the rage in the eastern and southeastern United States, and people in the Midwestern states ate it with maple syrup or molasses. In Eastern Europe, milk was poured over the meal once served and cooled down, rather than being boiled in it. Imagine a bowl of yellow, gluey goop that your grandma would call comfort food. Don't get me wrong, I love a good hearty bowl of oatmeal, but cornmeal mush? That's a whole different level of bland. Apparently, people used to fry it up for breakfast. I mean, I guess it's a way to add some crunch to your mushy morning meal. This dish was a staple in many households during hard times because it was cheap, filling, and versatile. However, in today's world of avocado toast and acai bowls, cornmeal mush just doesn't stand a chance. Chitlins, or chitterlings, are not for the faint of heart. We're talking pig intestines. Yep, you heard that right. These were cleaned, boiled, and sometimes fried up as a delicacy. Well, more like a necessity. Chitlins were a way to make sure no part of the animal went to waste, especially during lean times. They were also sometimes filled with forcemeat to make sausage, and intestines from other animals, such as cow, lamb, goose, and goat, were also used for making chitterlings. This strange delicacy was a traditional food of the southern United States that spread nationwide with the Black migration. These were taken off our dinner tables for better or worse. It's the kind of dish that makes you appreciate how far food has come and perhaps makes you grateful for modern refrigeration and food safety standards. Speaking of strange meals, wait till you hear about hog maw. Now, this is a dish that's sure to impress your dinner guests. It's basically a pig's stomach stuffed with, well, who knows? Probably whatever was lying around. When you think of luxurious foods, a pig's stomach is probably the last thing that comes to mind. But back when wallets were tight, people had to make do with whatever they could find. It was found in American, soul food, Chinese, Mexican, Portuguese, Italian, and Vietnamese dishes. Hog maw was especially popular in Pennsylvania Dutch country, where nothing went to waste. Now, hog maw might sound a little fear factor-ish, but it was actually a way to stretch ingredients and make a filling meal for the whole family. It's like the ultimate meatloaf, if meatloaf came with an organ-based casing. These days, the idea of eating a pig's stomach might turn some people off, but back in the day, it was just another way to enjoy a meal. Scrapple was the typical everything but the oink dish. This Pennsylvania Dutch classic was made from pork scraps. Yes, that includes everything from the snout to the tail, combined with cornmeal and flour, then formed into a loaf. It is also known by the Pennsylvania Dutch name panhaas. Scrapples and panhaas were commonly considered ethnic foods of the Pennsylvania Dutch, including the Mennonites and Amish. Scraps of meat left over from butchering not otherwise used or sold were made into scrapples to avoid waste. It's like your grandma's meatloaf with a whole lot more mystery meat. Scrapple had a love it or hate it reputation. For some, it was a comfort food that reminded them of home. For others, it was a mysterious meat block they'd rather avoid. It's definitely an acquired taste, one that has not quite made it to mainstream breakfast menus. And don't even get me started on the texture. I'll leave a little to your imagination. First on the list is my dad's ultimate favorite meal, delicious spaghetti and meatballs, without needing a fancy description. All that was needed was some ground beef, breadcrumbs, a couple of eggs, tomato sauce, vinegar, a dash of brown sugar, and the most important element, obviously, spaghetti. By the way, pasta was considered a staple in my household, and should be once again, as the world is your oyster when it comes to its endless possibilities. Undoubtedly, a true Italian delicacy, but many culinary experts would disagree since this dish has origins dating back to ancient Persia. Other nations include Sweden, China, and Greece. Nonetheless, it seems to still be favored by many, globally. Bulk cooking has increased in popularity, trending that Mom did know what she was talking about. Therefore, my next choice for affordability must be casseroles. And I mean, who does not love a good casserole? The variations of casseroles seem to span back to times we cannot even imagine. As it happens, casserole is a French word that means saucepan. It is one of the oldest methods of communal eating, dating back to 1708. On second thought, be honest. Throwing all that you can into one pot, steaming it for a couple of hours, and serving a hot and delicious meal that serves many can be anyone's first choice when it comes to budget friendliness. Who else agrees? Please don't tell me that my subconscious sentimental mind is the only one. Shepherd's pie is an American classic for many reasons besides just being the expected main course whenever you were heading on over to your grandparents'. It has the gravy, the meat, and mashed potatoes, which all combine together to make for a pretty comforting meal. The kind of dish that really takes the edge off, you know? Plus, grandmas would usually stick to the traditional recipe of using ground lamb. Differences between various kinds of lamb can make or break a good shepherd's pie, but our elders seem to have it nailed down to instinct. Combine an extremely solid taste with the fact that it was pretty cheap to make, with the most expensive part just being your protein, and you have a dish that can easily stand the test of time. If you were going on over to your grandparents for a casual Christmas or Thanksgiving visit, you may have been surprised to find that the dinner table was anything but casual, with delicacies like squash casserole. Creamy, crunchy, and filled with cheddar cheese and crackers, it is an all-time favorite that has been a staple of holidays and birthdays in many households. It was more popular to correctly reflect past tense in the 20th century, which explains why you would usually only find your grandparents making it, and back then, it would be very common to have this at potlucks. Some households still have it at theirs, but the trend has taken a bit of nosedive with the cracker and cheese combo taking a bit of a backseat. That only goes for if you are ordering a squash casserole from a restaurant, though, because from the hands of any American granny, it was a dish impossible to resist. Speaking of cheddar cheese and nostalgic family meals, we cannot go without mentioning the ever-timeless King Ranch chicken casserole. This is definitely a dish for those people who feel like casseroles without meat or protein of any kind are missing something and do not feel as fulfilling. It would take about an hour to cook, but this did massive numbers in every neighborhood from Detroit to Texas. Especially more so in the South, it was a common practice for families to preserve their King Ranch chicken casserole recipes. The real strength of the dish was that you could use as much of the ingredients as you wanted, letting you double or even triple the dish, an advantage that Southern grandmas would very often use when they were in the mood to dote on their grandkids. Cracklins, on the other hand, I can get behind. They're basically pork rinds, but with a fancy name. Finally, a normal, delicious meal that doesn't make your nose wrinkle. Cracklins were essentially the popcorn of the pork world. These crispy, crunchy bits were made from frying pieces of pork fat and skin until they puff up and become irresistible little nuggets. In the days when every part of the pig was used, cracklins were a way to make a snack out of what would otherwise be discarded. But here's the catch. These didn't really have a lot of benefits when you ate them. Yeah, nothing really screams healthy about eating deep-fried pieces of pork. Think of them as the porky cousin of potato chips. These days, you're more likely to find them in specialty Southern stores than on your local supermarket shelf. Cracklins may not be the healthiest choice, but they're a tasty reminder of a time when people knew how to make the most of what they had. Okay, if you have a light stomach, this next one's not for you. Chicken feet. You heard that right? Now, we're getting into some real survival food territory. Chicken feet might sound like a strange choice for a meal, but in many cultures, they're considered a delicacy. These little feet are often used to make rich, flavorful broths and soups. The high collagen content gives the broth a silky texture that's perfect for sipping on a cold day. However, chicken feet aren't exactly the most popular menu item in the West, or at least anymore. They were big back when people had to eat whatever they could find, like the tough days of the Great Depression. But in today's modern world, chicken feet are a big no thank you. They're a bit bony and can be a challenge to eat, which might be why they haven't caught on like, say, chicken wings. But for those in the know, they're a tasty, nutrient-rich part of the chicken that's worth trying at least once. Just don't expect to see them in your local fast food chain anytime soon. Tripe is the edible stomach lining of cows, and it's one of those ingredients that makes you go, really? But in many cultures, tripe was a beloved dish, often cooked in soups and stews. Here's the thing. These poverty foods weren't just about using the cheapest ingredients available. They were about resourcefulness and respecting the entire animal. People found ways to use every part, from the meat to the organs and even the stomach lining, turning what others might discard into nourishing meals. Now, as for tripe, it has a unique texture that's chewy but tender, and it soaks up flavors beautifully. Back in the day, it was a cheap way to add protein to a meal, especially when times were tough. It's the kind of dish that takes some getting used to, both in terms of taste and texture. Today, tripe is more likely to be found in ethnic cuisine than on the average American dinner table. It's one of those foods that hasn't quite stood the test of time, but it still has a loyal following among those who appreciate its unique qualities. Now, mashed potatoes and gravy need no introduction or explanation. Everyone and their mother's mother has had it. But did you know how good they were at making it? Receiving this dish from the chefs of generations ago was an entirely different experience in comfort. We do not know what spices they would mix, as each area had its own variations, with some even using mushrooms. Most popular was coriander, thyme, black pepper, and some oregano. The gravy would even put KFC to shame, if we are being completely honest. You just did not feel like eating from the outside when you had such fine dining available at home, and it was the perfect thing to get you back up only our feet from an exhausting day. Southern skillet cornbread has been a beloved memento of the South for many decades to the rest of the nation, but in the area, it is a tradition that goes back all the way to the 18th century. History books tell us that it comes from Native American cuisine, and it makes sense since a lot of Native American cuisine was very cost-effective. It is kind of everything you would want in a home-cooked meal, easy on the wallet, simple ingredients you can find at any nearby store, and little prep time, which means you can get your cravings fulfilled immediately. Plus, most cooks back then were so accustomed to it from a lifetime of making cornbread in these cast-iron skillets that they could make it much faster than even an experienced cook. Guess experience counts for something, especially when you have 40 to 50 years of it, right? Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. A lot of the recipes from the times of our parents come from the Depression and from when America was recovering from it, but things like baked ziti is what they would whip up when they had a bit of money in their pocket. Some cooked ziti, ricotta cheese, eggs, and spaghetti sauce meant for an incredibly easy and amazing pasta. If you had the Parmesan to spare, you could also sprinkle it on or add a melted layer as a topping. It did not take too long to make, and it tasted very different from regular pasta or spaghetti and meatballs, which was a recipe favored by moms more than grandmas. The real highlight of the dish is in the shape of the ziti, since they end up being these 25 to 30 centimeter tubes. When they turn into soft pasta, they become great for chewing and work really well with the cheese. Grandmas would always spice it up with some beef or duck here and there, though. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. There are some baking challenges that only your grandmother is equipped for, and making the pinnacle of brown butter sweet potato pies was one of them. Seriously, even bakeries and fancy eateries have struggled to nail every aspect of a pie, but for most home chefs in the United States, it seems to be just another Tuesday with the oven. You take a flaky pie crust with a velvety potato filling that is usually topped off with whipped cream, but most older cooks preferred maple syrup as that was what they grew up with. Just a bit of dark brown sugar would elevate this dish into the perfect dessert, though it would often steal the show entirely on its own. The thing is built to make your mouth water, and we mean looks-wise too, since the brown and caramel hues of the pie just make it all the more enticing. Have you ever heard of this one before, and would you try it? Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Speaking of economics, the following mom-made specialty was homemade pasta sauce. Recently, I was quite shocked to see the huge amounts of jar-filled pasta sauces, as my mom taught me the old-fashioned way to make it with the use of only a few ingredients. For example, the top components to make an awesome-tasting sauce consist mainly of the following: a couple of smushed-up red tomatoes, finely chopped onion, herbs, and spices. Now, bear in mind that I had 2 older brothers, so this sauce was a necessity, as their appetites seemed insatiable. Similarly, pasta sauce is closely associated with Italian cuisine. Although tomatoes were introduced to Italy in the 16th century, it wasn't until the 17th century that tomato-based sauces gained popularity, securing their place in culinary history, with its first mention in a cookbook compiled by a chef, L'Apiccio Moderno, in 1790. This brings me back to one important aspect: the value of family. On the other hand, without going on a nostalgic tangent, let's delve into yummy baked potatoes, this time with a twist. Note that this version I am about to discuss has now transformed itself into a popular fast food item. Despite that, it is easy to do at home. All you need is a well-done baked potato, then stuffed with some yummy treats that are budget-friendly as well, and if you are feeling adventurous, a splash or two of sour cream. Perfect. Anyhow, this may seem like a new spin-off to many families, but researchers have discovered that native South American cultures have been using it as a staple for thousands of years. Although their techniques are questionable at best for modern society, as they usually include things like a banana stuffed with rice. The best homemade meal, in my opinion, was lasagna. Nowadays, people enjoy this dish on laid-back Saturday afternoons. And to be honest, I agree. Leave it in the oven for an hour, and a cheesy-filled indulgence is born. These components include the basic kitchen must-haves, layers of lasagna sheets, pasta sauce, and some cheese, of course. It has met those expectations of the history books as well. Did you know that its origins are implanted in the backstories of ancient Greece? Yes, you heard me right. This was not an original Italian cuisine. Nevertheless, many dispute that the first record of such a recipe being written down dates back to Naples during the Middle Ages. But wherever it started, it's now seen as a go-to dish in any household, no matter the country. Another item on this list is head cheese. Don't let the name fool you. There's no cheese in head cheese. Instead, it's a terrine or meat jelly made from the flesh of a pig or calf's head. Sounds appetizing, right? Variations of head cheese exist throughout Europe and elsewhere, with differences in preparation and ingredients. A version pickled with vinegar is known as sauce. Head cheese was a way to use every part of the animal, especially during times when food was scarce. It's a dish that's rich in flavor and history, but not exactly a crowd pleaser in modern times. While you might still find it in some specialty delis, it's not the kind of thing you'd bring to a potluck without a disclaimer. Pot liquor is the savory, nutrient-rich liquid left over after boiling greens like collards, kale, or mustard greens. This flavorful broth was often sopped up with cornbread or drank straight from the bowl. It's packed with vitamins and minerals, making it a staple in many Southern households. In a world obsessed with bone broth and kale smoothies, you'd think pot liquor would be all the rage. But for some reason, it hasn't quite made the leap to the mainstream. Maybe it's the name, or maybe it's just too old-fashioned for today's palate. Either way, pot liquor is a delicious, nutritious throwback to a time when people didn't let anything go to waste. It's a dish that deserves a comeback, even if just for its health benefits. Hoppin' John is a Southern classic made with black-eyed peas, rice, and pork, often flavored with onions, garlic, and spices. This dish was traditionally eaten on New Year's Day for good luck and prosperity, with the peas representing coins and the greens often served alongside representing dollars. Some recipes use ham hock, fatback, country sausage, or smoked turkey parts instead of bacon. A few use green peppers or vinegar and spices. Hoppin' John was a hearty, comforting dish that's perfect for feeding a crowd on a budget. It was a one-pot wonder that brings together simple ingredients in a delicious way. However, despite its tasty credentials, Hoppin' John hasn't quite made it to the top of the culinary charts. It's a dish steeped in tradition, but not one that has a big presence in today's trendy food scene. That said, it's still a beloved dish in the South and a tasty way to start the new year. Fatback. Just the name sounds delicious, right? Wrong. Fatback is basically just a slab of pure pig fat. This cut of pork was often used to flavor dishes or rendered into lard for cooking. In times of scarcity, fatback was a valuable ingredient because it added flavor and richness to otherwise bland meals. You could fry it up to make crispy bits or use the rendered fat for cooking just about anything. Fatback is the unsung hero of many Southern dishes, providing that extra bit of flavor that makes everything taste better. However, in today's world of lean meats and health-conscious eating, fatback hasn't quite kept up. It's the kind of thing that makes dietitians shudder, but still holds a nostalgic place in the hearts of many. While it's not as popular as it once was, fatback remains a key ingredient in traditional Southern cooking, and for good reason, it's delicious. Potted meat is a canned meat product that was a staple in many households during tough times. Made from a mix of meats, including beef and pork, it's ground into a paste and seasoned. It's often used as a spread on crackers or bread, making it a quick and easy snack or meal component. Potted meat has a long shelf life, which makes it perfect for stocking pantries during uncertain times. It's not exactly gourmet fare, but it got the job done. However, in today's era of fresh whole foods, potted meat has fallen out of favor. It's the kind of thing you might find in a survival kit or on a camping trip, but not something you'd serve at a dinner party. Still, for those who grew up with it, potted meat holds a special place in the pantry of memories. Meals aren't limited to just meat. Mouth-watering vegetarian curries are a fantastic option as well. Yes, there are indeed a lot of people who believe this dish to be expensive regarding the high prices of fresh veggies these days. Yet, this can be disproved. Thus, I have found a method that is most definitely budget-wise, with the use of a pack of frozen mixed vegetables. Additionally, there is a misconception that this meal is rather spicy. But if used wisely and sparingly, the addition of the vital curry powders can be indicated to be a true winner. While many believe this dish originated in India, historians have shown that it also has roots in Britain, dating back to the time of British rule in India. Lots of people around the globe would debate about the true origin of this next meal, which was always one of many meals my mom, especially my grandmother, used to make. Nonetheless, let's dive headfirst into this delicious meal, pantry-friendly chicken a la king. Weirdly enough, as a child, this meal seemed so fancy, yet it could be enjoyed anytime. All you would need are milk, flour, salt and pepper, green bell peppers, mushrooms, and chicken over a heaped spoon of rice. Coming back to the aforementioned origins of this dish, well, it is a widespread belief that it was first served to patrons of New York's Brighton Beach Hotel way back in the 1980s by its inventor, per se, E. Clark King II. Whichever way the cookie crumbles around its history, it's one of those meal options that, by the turn of the century, took flight worldwide. Recently, I learned about a new term, frugal meals. I thought back to one thing my mom used to make that could be seen in the same light. Well, rather befittingly, she used to make us her homemade pizza with the use of only a few pantry-stored items and fridge favorites. So, with this meal, you will need flour, salt, Italian herbs, tomato sauce, eggs, and water. Later, when the dough is all spread out, just add the toppings, such as sausages with some cheese. Historically speaking, it is believed that many natives from Naples sold similar flatbreads with toppings years before. Nevertheless, the legend goes that a baker by the name of Raffaele Esposito gained credit for this dish after making a pizza for King Umberto I and Queen Margherita in 1889. Beef stew is a nostalgic childhood dish nobody can go without. Fresh pearl onions and a broth made out of the beef stock were the tricks to an unbeatable stew that is sorely missed every time you eat one that is not your grandma's. The modern-day beef stew involves an entire list of 10 ingredients for better readability that feels more like an overdone broth mixed with a lot of toppings. But that is because beef stews have gone a bit out of fashion unless you are in the South. This is also because beef stews today are usually made with red wine as a base. But the hearty and vigor-filled ones of your childhood were all about keeping it simple with vegetables and a solid cut of beef. Flaky buttermilk biscuits are all well and good if you buy them as a snack at your local mart. But you have not tried a buttermilk biscuit until you get a veteran baker to make these for you. Who better than family? And what family member is more skilled in baking than your trusty grandmother? Well, not all of them cook or bake, but the nation has more than its fair share of grandma's creamy buttermilk recipes floating around the internet and cookbooks from dozens of years ago. Practice always makes perfect, and most home chefs learned that the great secret of an impeccable buttermilk biscuit is to not overmix so that you avoid flat and tough biscuits. These were extremely common as snacks to give to children in the family during holidays and were the perfect pairing for a gift basket. Here is a dish that you have probably heard of one too many times but never gotten enough of: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Let's just say that comfort cooking really does not get much higher than this, nor more relaxing. Sitcoms, movies, and comedies across the decades that depict middle-class families always have somebody serving up a killer meatloaf, and it is for good reason. Our generation's parents always grew up eating a hearty meatloaf with a side of perfectly mushy soft potatoes, so it is no wonder that they kept the custom going. Today, mashed potatoes have an 85% popularity rate, which even beats hamburgers and cheeseburgers. You would think that those would be America's top one, but it seems nothing can beat Grand's meatloaf classics. A recipe that is largely forgotten right now but still made some noise back when it was really popular in the 20th century is shrimp and grits. The secret to an incredible plate of these was all in the milk, butter, and cheddar cheese. Depending on the quality and how you handled it, you would ever have shrimp that had not really absorbed the flavor or the best seafood experience you could hope to have at home. Luckily, over many long years, the home cooks of our nation perfected the recipe and kept passing it down, one generation to the next. Some chopped bacon for a smoky flavor, or sausage drippings were also really popular picks for older chefs to run with. Grits would be made with dent corn and often boiled, then mixed with the butter and milk. How did your family make these, if they ever did? Collard greens and ham hocks have been a combo that has very faithfully stood the passing of time, and we think it is partly due to all the different takes on it that families keep coming up with. You hear cabbage and your heart does not exactly burst with excitement, but collard greens is another story. Pair it up with smoky ham hocks and you have yourself a meal on a budget like no other. A ham hock itself is a portion of bone with connective tissue and some meat that is covered in fat and skin, and the other name for these is pork knuckles. With some sweet onions, garlic, and chicken broth, this was a recipe that would give any other dish a run for its money, and it was great for your diet too. Gotta make sure your grandkids grow up right and proper after all. Next, when all else fails, when it came to the perfect side for any meal, my mom almost always turned to that yummy yet savory treat of cornbread. Not only is this a great indulgence just on its own, but a great addition to things such as ribs and a bowl of wholesome chili. Many pantry stored items would quickly jiffy up this sweet bread, which mainly consisted of corn flour, baking powder, oil, and eggs. On the topic of its versatility, I fondly remember that my mom used to include whole sweet corn from cans into the batter. And when I say that it was a hit every time, it's not an understatement. Even though it's like a treat nowadays, it stemmed from extremely harsh times when it was introduced as a way to survive those first few harsh years of American settlers. The following digresses a little from Mom's favorite meals, as it is more meant for those sweet tooth moments. Especially suitable for brunch, nothing screams louder when it comes to budget-wise meals than French toast. Easily, this would be a go-to for any family when finances are rough, as a great breakfast change or just for a yummy snack once in a while. I think the popularity of this meal is rather understated, as it even progressed in a rather quick fashion to a very popular cuisine in many countries. With various versions available, in my opinion, the best was and still is the old-fashioned and traditional one, where all you need are eggs, bread, butter, and some syrup. The name of the dish is rather misleading, especially when you take into account that the French did not invent it. It was more an American favorite, who titled it this way, due to French immigrants who popularized the dish. It is believed that it stems back to ancient Rome. Before jumping into the next one, keep in mind that it might be the easiest one to date. Classically, this meal can also be categorized as the most wholesome and budget-friendly one, especially when month-end seemed so far away. So, without further reminiscing, it's chicken noodle soup. Best described as a one-pot meal, it bellows effortlessness and includes everything to be thrown into a slow cooker. Things you will need are the basics, such as broth, chicken, noodles, seasonings, and veggies. Another great reason this one ranks so high is the fact that it's great when cooking in bulk, frozen and warmed up later for some yummy lunchtime memories. Who else remembers this as the best way to warm up or have the flu? Additionally, I also believe that its spotlight is well-deserved, as its origins started over 10,000 years ago with the domestication of fowl in Asia. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Potted huff is a dish made from the meat of the shin of a cow or pig, cooked and pressed into a pot with its own jelly-like juices. It's similar to head cheese but focuses on a specific part of the animal. This dish was often seasoned and served cold, sliced up with bread or pickles. Back in the day, potted hoof was a way to make use of tougher cuts of meat that needed slow cooking to become tender. It was a popular dish among working-class families in the UK and the US, providing a hearty, protein-rich meal. Nowadays, potted hoof has largely disappeared from the culinary scene, replaced by more refined meat products. It's a dish that hasn't stood the test of time, but it still offers a glimpse into the resourceful cooking of past generations. Clabber is soured milk that was often used in baking or eaten as a spread with sugar or fruit. Before the days of refrigeration, clabber was a common way to use up milk that had started to sour. The natural bacteria in the milk would ferment it, creating a thick, yogurt-like consistency. Clabber might sound a bit strange to modern ears, but it was a staple in many households. It's similar to yogurt or buttermilk, both of which are still popular today. However, clabber itself has fallen out of favor, likely due to its strong, tangy flavor and the modern preference for fresher dairy products. It's a reminder of a time when people made use of every bit of food they had. Hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit, is a simple, hard biscuit made from flour and water. It was a staple for sailors, soldiers, and pioneers because it had a long shelf life and was easy to transport. The downside? It was so hard that it could break your teeth if you weren't careful. Hardtack was often soaked in water or soup to soften it up before eating. It wasn't exactly tasty, but it provided the necessary calories to survive long journeys or tough times. Today, hardtack is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry staple. It's the kind of thing you might try once for the experience, but it's not something you'd want to eat regularly. It's a relic of a time when food was more about survival than enjoyment. Pickled pig's feet are exactly what they sound like. Pig feet that have been pickled in a vinegar solution with spices. This dish was popular in the South and among certain ethnic groups, offering a tangy, chewy treat that was often eaten as a snack or side dish. The process of pickling preserved the pig's feet, making them a practical choice in times before refrigeration. The vinegar and spices added a punch of flavor that helped mask the natural taste of the feet. Today, pickled pig's feet are more of a novelty than a common food item. They might still be found in some specialty stores, but they're far from a mainstream snack. It's a dish that has mostly fallen out of favor, but for those who enjoy it, it's a taste of nostalgia. An old favorite recipe that has truly made its mark as a go-to meal is the fail-proof omelet. All you needed were eggs, cheese, and whatever you had in the fridge to throw into it. Mine was and still is that of bacon. Many even opt for some vegetarian options. Well, whichever filling suggestion you prefer, this long-forgotten mom-made recipe must be one to nurture as a genuine budget-friendly meal. Did you know that the word omelette is French? So it's befitting to know that its origins are cemented within French history as early as the 14th century. Well, there are so many versions of it that it's rather difficult to keep up, yet one stands out to be interesting and different. Japan, where it would be made into a rectangular shape to be later cut into pieces and served with dips. I've now reached the final, most beloved star of Mom's recipe book, meatloaf. It is so popular that it has genuinely stood the test of time as a recipe that cannot be forgotten. Not only is it super easy to make, but it takes a handful of ingredients to complete. And best of all, it's ready within an hour. On the other hand, there are so many variants of this meal, but everyone always reverts to its original form that screams traditional. It requires minced beef and binding agents, which are then later battered to perfection, laid into a bread pan, and glazed for that perfect caramelized appearance. Regrettably, it seems that this dish might be extremely underappreciated, regardless of how deep its history lies. For example, many say that it never was an official all-American type of meal. Various scholars show that it has roots in many culinary cultures, for instance, Germans, Romans, and even medieval Europe. Twice-cooked potatoes are firmly a thing of the past now, but that does not mean this video cannot serve as your inspiration to bring back this hit, which was especially popular with grandmas all around the country. Like we said with the previous dish, something being good for your health and tasty does wonders for its appeal, and Granny's knows how to get the best of both worlds. Double cooking always had a benefit because it made them a lot easier to digest and increased their starch. They would prick the potatoes, cook, cool, then cook again before topping it off with green onions and bacon. An incredibly American idea, but also an extremely flavorful one, so do not hesitate to give this one a go. Want to go for another odd dish that brightens the mood up at parties, holidays, and feasts alike? Broccoli cheese casserole was the American populace's answer to concerns about how the diet of kids these days just does not have enough green at them. The age-old question of how do we make broccoli taste as good as a cheeseburger still stood pretty firm though, and one genius in the 1800s had the bright idea of mixing broccoli into a casserole. As you must be quite familiar with by now, America tends to add cheese to anything it can see, so it does not take a lot to figure out how this came to be. A creamy sauce with fresh broccoli florets and cheese crackers are a tried and tested 1900s combo. If you ever found yourself wondering what people did to celebrate fall back in the days of your grandparents, then wonder no longer, because we have the answer. Dishes like butternut squash mac and cheese fulfilled that craving of comfort food that the fall season tends to bring, while also being new and fresh enough to keep things interesting. Mac and cheese is already known for being pretty creamy texture-wise, but the squash just takes that and amplifies it tenfold. Also, it sneaks in some sweetness in there too, which really brings the entire dish full circle. This dish is a favorite of people who are in their 40s or 50s, and they would always go overboard with the squash. The difference in this dish is that it does not require you to make a roux with flour and butter and uses pureed roasted squash as the base for the cheese sauce. It actually works a lot better than regular mac and cheese, so if you have ever had Grandma make this for you, send her a thank you text. To really appreciate the dedication to the bit it takes to make a fantastic heirloom tomato pie, you need some backstory on what heirloom tomatoes really are. See, these are special fruits that are open-pollinated and have been passed down for some 40 to 50 years across many generations of a family. Before they were commercially introduced in 1940, that was the way to do it at least, and a batch of these would often be used to whip up one of the best tomato-based dishes you will ever have the pleasure of tasting. We guess it takes the term generational food to an entirely new, literal level. The tomato flavor given by these is acidic and sweet, and there are very few seeds. The sensation and taste has often been compared to pineapples before, due to how explosive the flavor is. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seem to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread. And sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? When it comes to budget, nothing screams out more than that of chicken and dumplings. The meal can be regarded as boring, but it's a great-tasting delicacy, especially during those cold winter months. Besides it being a great tummy filler, it is truly a great way to cook economically, as all you need to do for the chicken is boil it to the brim of shreds, either in some chicken stock. Next, boil together. As easy as this dish sounds, it is a true version of what family-oriented meals mean. It began as a mainstay in many homes during the Great Depression. Yet, other experts claim that this kind of eating originated when German immigrants first came to America, with the word dumpling translating to Knödel in German. Many agree that this simple meal can be enjoyed anytime, anywhere. It boils down to one universal thing: sloppy joes. I, however, do acknowledge that this might not be a very refined one. For this mom-made specialty, all you need are the basics, usually in your pantry or freezer, such as ground beef, salt, garlic, onions, and buns. You could opt to throw everything in a slow cooker or take an alternative route that saves time, taking a potato masher and tenderizing the sloppiness. Then you take a bun, toast it nice and warm, and slap on the meat, and there you go, a meal in minutes. The original story behind this meal dates back to Iowa, where a cook dished up loose meat in between bread with some tomato sauce. This then became a quick favorite amongst many Americans up until today. Next, we have shepherd's pie, also known as cottage pie, a meal that has always lived up to its potential. Whichever way you know this dish, it was one of the many staple meals in my childhood, as leftovers were assured. So, you might be wondering what is needed to complete such a savory pie. Well, I'm about to astonish you, as you only need mashed potatoes, butter, garlic, or herbs, minced meat, and cheese. First off, I would like to point out that there is nothing wrong with taking shortcuts in cooking, referring to the fact that nowadays, pre-packaged cottage pie cook-in sauce is readily available. So go ahead and skip on time if that is your heart's content and dish up a wholesome meal. Furthermore, historical facts are rather compelling, as they date back to the 18th century, when this new dish was mainly served in a vast amount of regions throughout Ireland and the United Kingdom. Pasta is a staple in any home, as it can be prepared quickly and affordably. One great example is fettuccine alfredo. It was always a dish to die for. These budget-friendly recipes included pantry favorites: fettuccine pasta, 2 sticks of butter, cream, seasoning, and garlic. Frankly, it might not be a favorite health-conscious option. While many assume fettuccine alfredo originated in Italy, this is not entirely accurate. Many speculate about this theory that it was recorded to have originated in Rome in the 20th century. However, it was invented by a man, Alfredo di Lelio. It is now a renowned dish known by many versions and has been published hundreds of times in cookbooks since as early as 1933. And Viola, a legend, was born. Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how 2 people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. Where would we be a nation without bread pudding? Especially the slow-cooked variant. Now, this dish is already well known for its soft and spongy consistency, which is part of why it has the name bread pudding. But slow cooking takes it up several notches. If you ever wondered what eating a cloud might feel like, we think this is the closest humanity will get to the experience. Using the bread as a cereal base and being slow-cooked for around 2 to 3 hours, grandmas would often add an assortment of different nuts and spices to really get this dish shining as bright as it cold. Some raisins here, a touch of cinnamon and plump there, plus the freshest French bread you could get your hands on. All of it made for an incredible experience that made this the perfect brunch option to go for. And if you were not feeling brunch, it worked just as well as a breakfast or even late-night post-dinner snack. Let's end our tour of the most famous dishes that our grandparents would prepare with one last trip to the South. And this one will take us to some pinto beans with ham. Specifically with ham hocks, as you may remember from earlier on. Dried pinto beans cooked on a stove to soak up all the flavor of the ham bone before they would go on to take every drop of goodness from the broth. Some fresh cornbread was the side of choice for this dish because when you dipped it with cornbread in specific, the harmony of flavors was just unbeatable. This dish was popular among our grandparents not only because it was budget-friendly, but also because a bag of beans could potentially serve up to 6 to 8 people. It was one of those things that really got you by the week, especially when finances would be tight. Well, sorrel soup is made from the sorrel plant, known for its tart, lemony flavor. This leafy green was often used in soups and stews, providing a bright, tangy taste that could liven up simple ingredients. Sorrel soup was especially popular in Eastern European and Middle Eastern cuisines, where it was often served with a dollop of cream or a boiled egg. Sorrel itself is a bit of a forgotten green these days, overshadowed by kale, spinach, and other more common leafy vegetables. Sorrel soup hasn't exactly made a splash in the modern culinary scene, but it's still a dish that holds a special place in the hearts of those who grew up with it. It's a refreshing, light soup that's perfect for a spring or summer meal, but it's not something you'll find on many restaurant menus today. Next up, we have cicadas. Yes, you heard that right. Cicadas. These insects were eaten during times of food scarcity, offering a protein-rich snack when other food sources were limited. Cicadas are actually quite nutritious, with a nutty flavor that's often compared to almonds or shrimp. Eating insects might sound strange to some, but it's a common practice in many cultures around the world. Cicadas, in particular, were a seasonal delicacy in certain regions, collected and cooked in various ways. In modern times, the idea of eating bugs hasn't quite caught on in the mainstream Western diet, although there's a growing interest in edible insects as a sustainable protein source. Cicadas may not have stood the test of time as a popular food, but they remain a fascinating part of culinary history. Pine needle tea is exactly what it sounds like, tea made from steeped pine needles. This beverage was often consumed for its supposed health benefits, including a high vitamin C content. During times when citrus fruits were scarce or expensive, pine needle tea provided a natural source of this essential nutrient. The flavor of pine needle tea is refreshing and slightly piney, with a hint of citrus. It's not the most conventional tea, but it has a certain rustic charm. However, it's not something you'll find on the shelves of your local tea shop. Pine needle tea is more of a survivalist or herbal remedy than a daily drink. While it hasn't become a mainstream favorite, it's still enjoyed by those who appreciate its unique flavor and natural benefits. Bean bread is a unique type of bread made by mixing cooked beans into the dough. This dish was a creative way to stretch ingredients and make a filling, nutritious meal. The beans added protein and fiber, making the bread more substantial than your average loaf. Bean bread has a dense, hearty texture and a slightly nutty flavor from the beans. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but it was a practical solution during times when flour was scarce or expensive. In today's world of artisan breads and gluten-free options, bean bread hasn't exactly made a comeback. It's one of those foods that feels like a relic from another time, but it's still an interesting part of culinary history. If you're feeling adventurous, it might be worth trying your hand at baking a loaf just for the experience. Who agrees that nothing feels more like home than mom's macaroni and cheese? Nowadays, prepackaged mac and cheese seems to be the easiest, yet it's just as cheap and tasty to make at home using the staples in any pantry. Now, I know I have done this before, but yet another term of roux has crossed my path. It sounds super fancy and difficult, but it's not. It's a method whereby you make a thickening agent essential to any winning mac and cheese. All you need is 1 part butter and flour as the base of your meal. Then all you need is the mac and, yes, the cheese. And to think it's all thanks to Thomas Jefferson, of all people, who made this dish popular after a historical trip to France when he brought it back to America. However, it is speculated that this dish was indulged in way before then, in 1769. Reminiscing about one's childhood, it's important to take note that Granny had her own unique set of skills in the kitchen. Mine, in particular, points to that of her chicken pot pie, which until today, my brothers and I craved. When thinking about the perfect meal that describes comfort and budget-wise cooking, this one has stood the test of time. It encompasses things such as a buttery crust made by the use of puff pastry, chicken, and veggies. Now, going back to the term roux, it's once again an excellent example of the perfect way to make a creamy sauce for this pie's filling. Leftovers from this dish could easily be frozen and reheated. Interestingly enough, the roots of this dish stem back to when European settlers made it out of the necessity of leftovers. This then only later on became an iconic American comfort food. An essential dish in my childhood home that lived up to its full potential was that of our favorite lunchtime meal, Mom's ramen noodles and veggie combo. Dare I say, nowadays it seems rather controversial, but we used to use the package of seasoning that was included to make the best version we could of authentic Japanese cooking. All that was needed were the noodles, spice pack, some broth, and veggies. Thus, I can confidently say that ramen noodles can be enjoyed in their simplest form. While we thought it to be just noodles, I was surprised to see the dish's origins, and it seems to be firmly rooted at first in China and only later introduced to Japan. However, it only took on its popularity in 1859 when the Chinese ambassador to Japan served it to the Emperor of Japan. Now that's how your grandma did it back then. Would you want to whip up these recipes again? If you do, like the video and subscribe for more.